with stolen organs.
I've been working out.
I think it was Dark Harvest where it happened. I was recently rewatching Invader Zim, and I got to Dark Harvest and it hit me. Somewhere in between Zim harvesting the organs of schoolchildren and this joke where an office worker's mouth literally becomes a dog food dispensary, I came to a kind of revelatory understanding. The gruesome, the grotesque, the sickening can be beautiful. Now, I understand there's an enormous sum of irony in that statement. I also understand that those words and beauty are usually mutually exclusive. But yet, as I sat there in complete awe of this children's show that somehow had the balls to literally turn itself into this horrifying spectacle of murder and body stuffing, I couldn't escape this feeling that what I was watching was art. Dark Harvest is the show at its absolute most chaotic and, in my opinion, at its closest to its creator's vision. It's where I began to understand the grotesque beauty of Invader Zim.
You're full of organs, aren't you?
Why, yes. Yes, I am.
And you wouldn't notice if you were, say, missing a few.
Invader Zim was not really designed to be a kid show. In fact, it was designed as the polar opposite. This is Johnny the Homicidal Maniac. It's a limited series comic created by Jonan Vasquez. It's a horror comic, very much aimed at adults about, well, murder. It's also great. From its visuals to its sparse and engaging narrative, it also led to a spin-off book, a 4-issue series titled Squee, that followed the misadventures of a kid and just so happened to be as dark and excellent as Johnny. Well, a Nickelodeon exec took a liking to Squee and asked Vasquez, who had no animation experience at all, to come up with a new idea for a show. In 1 hour, while lying in bed, he conceptualized and created Invader Zim. And what Vasquez envisioned was, as he put it, not a show for kids, but a show for him. And he had to fight to make that show. And that show was...
Okay,
well,
Dad, we can go to Bloody's now.
No, we can't go anywhere with him like that. Family night is cancelled until his organs are inside him again.
There is not another show in this era of television that was somehow allowed to turn a character inside out, have its intestines become its body, and be dragged like a dog on a leash across the screen. This is pure visual stimulation, but it's precise. The sequence lasts just over 10 seconds. It doesn't overstimulate the viewer, it doesn't stick around to become sickening. It happens so fast that you genuinely wonder if you saw what you just saw. And the image, because of its split-second nature, becomes the moment you continue to fixate on. You focus on that moment almost to recall it. It impacts you like seeing a striking piece of modern art because it's elusive in a way that understanding art often is, but in this case, that elusiveness is literal. Like this scene, where his eyes are gouged out and new synthetic eyes are placed in their stead. It's disgusting, but you don't see it. You imagine it. You conjure it. It's what makes the way this scene is animated so beautiful. It's a horror you help to create. Vasquez would say in 2018 that the show was preoccupied with an obliviousness to horror that allows horror to be normal, to be its characters and world's status quo. This allows the show to present its disturbed moments as moments, instead of long, drug-out spectacles. It allows them to be a shadow, or a 10-second fever dream, because to their characters, to its world, this is ubiquity. This is their normal. Take Nick. Nick here was created as a reference to the smiley, kid-centric network of Nickelodeon and the demands they made of the show's creators. This probe, shoved into his brain, is designed to force him into a constant state of happiness. He's in constant pain, it's terrifying, but to Zim, and to those that come in contact with Nick, it is what it is. Again, a world that normalizes terror, which in fact here is what makes the image of this kid in pain, being mentally decimated, so wonderfully horrifying. Zim just doesn't seem to care.
It's great! I never want to leave this magical place. I'm so happy!
But sometimes the visual horror is founded in sheer chaos. Take the episode Door to Door. These things being shoved into these kids' mouths are sausages that look like bugs. In fact, you can still see one of the bugs on the wall. That's because they were originally designed to be roaches, until Nickelodeon decided that was too disgusting and forced the change. In the very same episode, this elderly woman projectile vomits dust onto a beheaded Gur, and we're introduced to a race of doll-eating monstrosities. The key to all this absurdity is it lies in a simple, tropey, and often generic premise. Door-to-door sales, school fundraiser, Girl Scout cookies. The episode has little to no meaningful structure. It has next to no prevailing plot. It is pure anarchy. And Zim uses this anarchy and simplicity as a technique with which to deliver shocks. So often things dive into absurdity or fall into chaos so that you lose your previous understanding of where things are headed. So instead of being comfortable with what's happening, you're instead being exposed to a confusing discomfort, an unfamiliarity making the imagery all the more shocking. A good example of this is lice. This episode's foundation is a simple premise that's been explored dozens and dozens of times in animation and television. There's a breakout of lice at school. And yet, instead of the episode following the traditional tropes, it turns into a story of monster-based villainy. And just when you think you know how it's going to end, you're greeted with this.
The world will never have to deal with the threat of lice ever again.
Yes, that is a lice-killing weapon that sheared Zim's skin right off his body. It's shocking, but it's so satisfying to not know it's coming, to not understand what's happening, to not expect this moment. Because you think you've seen this story before. You think you know how this episode is going to play out, the sitcom trope of a school breakout, but you're wrong. Or Career Day, an episode about, you guessed it, a school career day, an episode that somehow manages to escalate into this glorious Akira reference. You think you understand the show until the moment where you don't. Gross out humor or horror often falls flat in animation because it's either poorly set up or, better yet, it's made to be the substance of the piece or show, the only reason you're watching it. Zim knows that to succeed with shock is to make sure that you, the viewer, believe you're one step ahead, even when you aren't, because that confidence makes you vulnerable.
I am Throbulator! I am a creature of pure headache! Yeah, my head!
But to create these horrors in this aesthetic, every second became a battle. Remember Nick, the walking Nickelodeon reference? He was created out of spite. Invader Zim was consistently hampered by Nickelodeon, the network. Characters weren't allowed to die according to the network, so episodes had to be rewritten, or things like this had to be defiantly placed at the end of an episode. Dib was actually meant to be killed off permanently in an episode and replaced with a new character, but the network wouldn't allow that to happen either, so the entire course of the show had to shift. But it even changed the visual nature of the show. Nick refused to allow blood splatter in multiple episodes, forcing the team to rethink certain sequences, and even certain bits of violence. Like here, Keith gets chased by a squirrel and falls, but in the original version, he was supposed to fall off a building into an electrical line to be electrocuted. Nick didn't like that. Nick wanted to rethink Dib's clothing because trench coats were too reminiscent of a recent and terrible event, so the team had to fight to save his aesthetic. They even had to fight to save the character when Nick wanted to cut him for not being funny or likable enough. Invader Zim wasn't happy. It wasn't about sunshine and rainbows, and every step of the way its creators fought to maintain their vision. Every boundary they got pushback on, they pushed in a different, almost defiant way. The horror in Invader Zim, specifically the horror that is Nick, is a response to everyone that wanted Zim to be something it wasn't. And I think in an almost romantic way, Nick is the best example of Zim using its imagery to actually say something substantive, to show that horror can still send a message.
No! It's horrible! Oh, the carnage makes me so happy!
And yet, I think the case of Bloody Gore is the best encapsulation of the strange, defiant, anti-culture horror that is Invader Zim. An image of Bloody Gore was created and then forbidden to be aired by Nickelodeon. So, animators behind the network's back snuck the image into single frames across the last season, only able to be viewed by viewing the episodes frame by frame. It's Zim's last bit of anarchy, its last moment of opposition, the show's last attempt to maybe subliminally drill its way into your mind. Zim was more than its imagery. It was an excellent story, a sci-fi comedy that was vast in scope and even more interesting in nuance. It was great because it succeeded beyond its horror. It succeeded as sci-fi, as a narrative, as a character study. But Invader Zim also had awful ratings, was, as its creator put it, monstrously expensive, and then it was canceled. And yet years later, its less than subtle horrors are still burned into my brain. Zim's horrifying beauty is to this day unrivaled in animation. There is art in horror, art in the grotesque, and art in its execution. It didn't care what the network wanted, it didn't care what its audience wanted. It was a show with a surprisingly unified vision. It managed to let the art, the grotesque, speak, through all the censorship. All these years later, I think it's clear that Zim did succeed in taking over the Earth and commanding humanity. The world of the gross, of the scary, is Zim's world. And I'm just happy to keep living in it.
Yes, yes, Lord of Humans! I will rule you all with an iron fist!
That is it for today's episode of Nerdstalgic, guys. As always, if you enjoyed the video, press that like button. And if you haven't yet, press subscribe as well. That way you don't miss anything that I put out. Also, next to the subscribe button is a little notification bell. If you hit that, that'll make sure you're actually notified when a new episode comes out. So hit the little bell as well. And as always, on your screen right now are 2 more episodes of Nerdstalgic. You can check out either of those to see what else has recently come out on the channel. And I will see you guys in the next video.